Hey guys, welcome back. So today we'll be reviewing integers. So let's review the definition first and then we will get into some examples. So let's look at this number here. So if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it goes all the way down, these are your counting numbers. Now, if I add a 0 in front of my 1 here, so if I do 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and go all the way down, this now is going to be your whole numbers. Your whole numbers start with the number 0, and your counting numbers, also known as natural numbers, starts with the number 1. Now, integers are going to be all of your whole numbers and the negative numbers. And in some places, the definition will be whole numbers and their opposites. So if I am including all of the whole numbers here and their opposites, I have my 0 here. This is going to be -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6, and it goes all the way down. So all of these are going to be integers. So just a quick recap. So we said counting numbers start with the number 1 and it goes all the way down. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And remember, counting numbers are also known as natural numbers. And I'll put a note here, also known as natural numbers. And then for your whole numbers, so whole numbers are very similar to counting numbers, except whole numbers start with the number 0 and it goes all the way down. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then integers are going to be all of your whole numbers and their opposites. So all of your whole numbers and the negative numbers. So now you are able to write your integers on a number line. So it's the very same exact thing that we did on top here. So this is going to be my 0, then I have 1, and I have 2, and I have 3, and I have 4, and it goes all the way down. And then here on your left side, you have -1, -2, -3, and then -4, and it goes all the way down. The numbers greater than 0 are your positive integers, and the numbers less than 0, these are going to be your negative integers. And then your 0 here is neither negative nor positive. So I'll do not negative or positive. So let's look at some examples. Is the number -15 an integer? Yes or no? Yes. -15 is an integer and it would fall here on the negative integer side. What about the number 5? Is the number 5 an integer? Yes or no? Yes, 5 is an integer. And if I graph it here on my number line, this would be a positive integer and it would fall on the right side of my 0. Is -3 an integer? -3 is an integer, and will this be on my right side of my 0 or the left side of my 0? And -3 would fall on the left side of my 0, which is a negative integer. What about the number 0? Is 0 an integer? Yes, 0 is an integer. What about the number 200? Is 200 an integer? Yes, 200 is an integer. What about -500? Yes, -500 is an integer. What about -100? Yes, -100 is an integer, and it's going to fall here on the left side of my 0. What about the number 1000? Is 1000 an integer? Yes, it's going to fall on the right side of my 0 as a positive integer. What about the fraction 1/2? Is 1/2 an integer? And the answer to this is going to be no. 1/2 is not an integer. And some of you may be thinking, well, 1/2 is on the number line. It falls right here, and how come it's not an integer? Well, my answer to that is going to be 1/2 is not a whole number, and it's definitely not a negative number. Remember, integers are whole numbers and their opposites. So whole numbers and negative numbers. 1/2 is not a whole number, so therefore 1/2 is not an integer. And even if I did -1/2, is -1/2 an integer? Nope, it is not an integer because -1/2 is not a whole number. Although it is a negative number, But 1 over 2, like we said, is not a whole number. What about 1.352? Is 1.352 an integer? This is not an integer because 1.352 is not a whole number. What about the decimal 4.9? Is 4.9 an integer? No, this is not an integer because 4.9 is not a whole number. What about the fraction 5 over 6? No, 5 over 6 is not an integer. What about 2.5? Is 2.5 an integer? No, 2.5 is not an integer. What about the fraction 12 over 4? Is 12 over 4 an integer? Now for this example, 12 over 4 equals 3. So is the number 3 an integer? Yes. So make sure when you are looking at your fraction examples, make sure that your fraction is fully simplified before answering. So 12 over 4, I can simplify that into 3. So therefore 3 is an integer because 3 is definitely a whole number and it falls right here on the right side of my 0. If 3 is an integer, is negative 3 an integer? Yes, negative 3 is an integer and it falls right here on the left side of my 0. What about 6 over 6? Is 6 over 6 an integer? Yes, the answer is going to be yes, because 6 over 6 simplifies to 1. Is the number 1 an integer? Yes, it is. So what about 8 over 2? And then here we'll say 2 over 8. So is the fraction 8 over 2 an integer? Yes, it is, because 8 over 2 equals 4, so this is going to be yes. And 4 is an integer. What about 2 over 8? The number 2 goes into both 2 and 8. So 2 divided by 2 is going to be 1, and then 8 divided by 2 is going to be 4. I'm left with 1 over 4. Is 1 over 4 an integer? No, it's not. Is 3.00 an integer? Yes, it is, because 3.00 is the same as the number 3. And is 3 an integer? Yes, it is. So even if I did negative 3.00, this is also an integer because negative 3.00 is the same as negative 3. Let's look at 1 over 3. Is 1 over 3 an integer? No, it's not an integer. What about the number 8? Is 8 an integer? Yes, 8 is an integer. And if 8 is an integer, is this a positive integer or a negative integer? And this is a positive integer that's going to be on the right side of my 0. Is 0 an integer? Yes, 0 is an integer. Negative 9. Is negative 9 an integer? Yes. Negative 9 is an integer, and that's going to be on the left side of my 0. This is going to be a negative integer. What about 8.7? Is 8.7 an integer? No, 8.7 is not an integer. And what about negative 8.7? Negative 8.7 is also not an integer. So let's look at some word examples. So let's say if I have a 15-yard loss, how would I write this as an integer? A 15-yard loss. This is going to be negative 15. And what if I said, let's look at this example, 3 inches above normal. 3 inches above normal. How would I write this as an integer? This is going to be plus 3. What if I said Sam withdrew $25 from his checking account? Is this going to be a positive 25 or a negative 25? Sam withdrew $25 from his checking account. This is going to be negative 25. So let's look at this example here. Sam deposited $100 in his savings account. Sam deposited $100 in his savings account. How would I write this as an integer? Is this going to be a positive 100 or a negative 100? And in this example here, this is going to be a positive 100. 10 degrees below 0. 10 degrees below 0. How would I write this as an integer? And as an integer, this is going to be negative 10. So let's look at this example, a gain of $2 a share. a gain of $2 a share, and this is going to be +2. A submarine is 200 feet below sea level. A submarine is 200 feet below sea level, and this is going to be -200. Let's look at this example, spending $25. Spending $25. How would I write this as an integer? This is going to be -25. Earning $50. Earning $50. As an integer, this is going to be +50. All right, so that is all for today, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye, guys.